Bark beetles are a natural component of Montana forests, northern Rockies ecosystems. And they're a small beetle that, as the name implies, a bark beetle, that is about the size of a barley kernel. And they will bore under the bark of a tree and lay their eggs. And the larvae that hatch from those eggs will feed underneath the bark on the living cambial tissue of the tree. And that's the only part of the tree that's actually growing. They also carry with them a fungus that infests the tree and plugs up the water transport mechanism within the tree. And the combination of both of those factors will then ultimately kill a tree if there are enough beetles attacking a tree. Trees have natural defense mechanisms. They've co-evolved with these beetles. So when beetles attack trees, they'll produce pitch, which is purely a defensive compound. And right here by my finger, you see this little blob right here. We can break it off. It's this sticky, gooey, resinous material. It's full of terpenes and phenolics, which are actually toxic to insects. So it's purely a defense mechanism. A lot of people call it sap, but it's not. Sap is what the tree uses to keep itself alive, water and sugar, etc. This is purely defensive mechanism. When there are an overwhelming number of beetles, several thousand or at least several hundred that attack a tree, it can overcome the tree's defenses and successfully colonize and kill the tree. Likewise, when a tree is stressed, it may not have the energy, particularly with water stress under drought conditions, have the water pressure available to push the pitch and successfully defend itself. To give a little idea what these beetles will then do, we can survey and look for broods by just peeling off some of the bark. This is a gallery that a mature beetle has eaten out of the inside of the tree. It then lays eggs on either side, and the larvae will feed outwards. And normally, this is now, we call this the sapwood of the tree. This woody tissue of the tree transports water from the root system up to the needles. The beetles, when they attack this tree, and when you look at this tree, there are hundreds of these little pitch tubes all over it. So there were enough that succeeded, and they introduced this we call black stain or blue stain fungus, which plugged the water transport mechanism of the tree, turned the sapwood blue or black, and that then killed the tree. Okay, this is the way bark beetles work. There's well over 100 different species of bark beetles. Most of them are specific to individual tree species. The one that we're most concerned about in Montana right now is the mountain pine beetle, which attacks pine trees, both 3-needled and 5-needled pine trees. So ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, white bark pine, which is a species of concern, are all being attacked by this beetle. Now, normally bark beetles are a natural component. They're kind of a chronic infestation in forests. They'll kill trees where they're overcrowded. There'll be small pockets of them here and there. This is quite normal. What's happened in the last decade is we've had a combination of effects occurring. One is a climatic effect. We've been warmer and drier than usual, which means summer drought, which causes the trees to be stressed for lack of water, which reduces their ability to defend themselves. The warmer summers are also conducive for beetle propagation. Their broods are more successful. 2 beetles will produce 80 offsprings. So those 80, if half are female, half are male, then you have 40 beetles, each producing 80 offspring. So in 3 generations, we can go from 2 beetles to almost 500,000 beetles. Just that's how fast they reproduce. Milder winters helps them overwinter. They usually overwinter, that is the mountain pine beetle overwinters as a larvae, a little grub under the bark. When we have extreme cold events, 30, 40 below zero for a week or so, those little larvae freeze and die. They produce antifreeze that stops working at about 40 below. And then the water in their bodies turns to ice, it expands, and the little guys just bust apart, basically. Cold spells in the spring also get them, or cold spells in the fall. So milder winters allows the broods to successfully overwinter. Drier summers stresses the trees. Longer season enhances the reproductive capability of the beetles. And those 3 things combined has led to a mountain pine beetle outbreak across Montana that's gone from this chronic type of episodes, little pockets here and there, to about 2.5 million acres out of our total of 25 million acres of forest being full of dead trees, and particularly areas around Great Falls, Butte, those areas. Now, there are other factors that play into this. The beetles like to hit larger mature trees or stressed trees. So the condition of the forest plays a part in that as well. When we have forests full of overly dense, that are overly stocked, a lot of dense trees, they're all competing with each other for water, plus they're all providing this huge food source. So it's kind of analogous to having a city that's very crowded with nobody younger than 60 years of age. You have a population that is ripe for an epidemic. In a human population, that might be a flu or something like that. In our forests, when we have a lot of overly dense, old-aged forests here in the Northern Rockies, they're predisposed to some kind of epidemic calamity. And so these type of cycles have occurred in the past. This one is probably larger than any that we've ever recorded in history. And that, again, has to do with this prolonged drought. Recent history, recorded history is pretty, maybe the last 150 years, but also that we have our forests are overly dense. And this is a result of past climatic events from the 1940s until about the 1980s. We were in a cool wet phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. That's our main climatic influence here in the Northern Rockies. I mean, everybody hears of El Nino and La Nina. We're influenced by Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And from the 1940s until the 1980s, we had one of the longest cool wet stretches. And what that leads to is prolific tree regeneration. Trees to regenerate need a nice cool wet summer, so those little seedlings, as seeds land on the soil, they have to compete with the grasses and the forbs and other trees. And when there's abundant moisture, a large percentage of those seeds will survive as seedlings, and you end up with these overly dense patches of regeneration. Because this is obviously a beetle-killed tree right here, and particularly ponderosa pine, within 3 to 5 years it falls over, and when it falls over in these forests, it creates these big, we call them jackstraw piles, where a lot of fuel complexity. It's airily suspended, which means it's dry. It's a mixture of the fine fuels, which is like kindling to a fire. This is what causes the rate of, or controls the rate of spread. But then it's also mixed in with the 100-hour and the 1,000-hour fuels, which add the energy to a fire. And this is what gives you the extreme heat out of a fire. So all of this material, when left up to nature, will fall over, will either burn or decompose and release the stored carbon dioxide in it. So this is part of the natural cycle. A small percentage of it might end up in the soil, but the majority of it ends right back up into the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas. So the alternative is to harvest this material, or harvest some of this material. We have so much of it in Montana, there's no chance of really over-harvesting, because it is a low-value product. Okay, it's not as concentrated energy as coal or oil is. So it's a little more expensive to get. It's a low-value product. So if we harvest this material and burn it in a cogen plant that produces steam with which we use to capture the heat from, and also electricity, we're actually using this to produce a bioenergy, a biorenewable form of electricity and heat. And the release of carbon dioxide is just the same as if you just leave it out here. Now, again, Northern Rockies ecosystems are fire-adapted ecosystems, so the greatest likelihood is that this will all burn in a massive wildfire. And that will, of course, mean we're going to spend millions and millions of dollars to try and contain this fire, to keep it from burning into urban areas, into population centers. So again, harvesting the biomass in appropriate scale, appropriate mosaics, is a win-win situation. Okay, what we're watching here is some of the most modern logging machinery available. It's called cut-to-length harvesting. The total machine costs about over $1 million. It's completely computerized. It's a self-leveling carriage so that it can work on all sorts of different slopes. And then the cutting head is also its own computerized cutting head. What it does is not only cuts down the tree, allows the logger to directionally fell the tree, and that means tip it over in the direction where it will do the least amount of harm. But then it's pre-programmed to actually measure the diameter of the stem that it's cut down to an optimal length, because lumber is cut in 8-foot or 16-foot dimensions usually for construction purposes, framing, etc. And so turning in a 6-foot log to a mill isn't going to get them anything because they can't cut lumber from it. So this is a highly efficient and super low impact piece of machinery. On average, it takes an operator's 3 years worth of training to proficiently use this. And the analogy is that this piece of machinery is as complex to operate as it is to fly an F-16 fighter. Because this blue-stained ponderosa pine is so low value because it makes really poor lumber. And what the logging industry, the forest products industry is battling with is we now have so much of this beetle-killed material and there's no market for it because the lumber it produces is inferior. So the solution that's come out of this with our global warming issues and the impacts that humans may have on increasing CO2 gases and greenhouse gases is to switch from fossil fuels to biorenewable energy. And wood is the ultimate of all biorenewable energies because as the tree grows, this wood is 50% carbon dioxide, fixed carbon dioxide into cellulose and hemicellulose and lignin. That's what wood is made of. Not much else in there. I mean, it has lousy nutritional quality, it's a very poor soil builder, but it's fixed carbon. And so if we take this waste material, not only the blue-stained logs, which have no market, but the debris that's in the foreground, and we want to leave some of the debris for wildlife microhabitat, a little bit for nutrient recycling. Again, wood is very low in nutrients for soil building. But we want to leave some, and we burn the rest for energy, for electrical power generation. This is then considered a neutral cycle because the energy generated from burning wood releases carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, but that same carbon dioxide is then fixed again as a new forest grows in its place and as new trees grow. And so that is why wood, particularly what would be considered waste wood, the beetle-killed trees that have no value in the lumber market, the residue, the small diameter material, it is the perfect source for energy production. Here on what's often been referred to as a skid trail. This is where the harvester that we viewed earlier has moved along with its boom reaching out and harvesting trees. And one of the innovations of the cut-to-length harvesting process is the tree will reach out with its boom, snip off a tree, pull it in front of itself, and delimit right in front of itself. So it actually walks on a mat of logging debris. And what this does is it limits the impact of the tracked equipment on the soil itself. It keeps it from being compacted. So if we look right down here, this appears to be the soil surface, but this is actually where the harvester delimbed and walked on. And if we dig down in here through this debris, we can see that it's actually about 6 inches of logging debris that it has operated on, thereby shielding the soil from any kind of soil compaction and erosion hazard that may occur. The logging industry in Montana is certified through the Montana Logging Association, and loggers go through an extensive training process where they take multiple classes in wildlife habitat, understory vegetation, insects, diseases, tree selection, forest management, etc., to attain what's called advanced logging professional status. And to maintain that status, they have to take refresher courses every year. And these are concentrated short courses, 1 to 3 day classes, where we talk about the practical aspects of wildfire management and mitigation, healthy forests, drought stress, insects, diseases. And the loggers are a wonderful audience because they're working in these forests every day. They see all of these things. So then when a university academic faculty like myself presents this concentrated information to them, they just absorb it. It makes sense because they have the practical background. You give them the academic part and they put it together. And I would say in Montana we probably have one of the most advanced and highly educated logging workforces in the entire United States because of this program. And so you can talk to any of these loggers and they can give you a wealth of background. These are highly skilled, highly educated individuals working on these, and the university system works together with these professions to make sure they're up to speed. And the overall goal of the loggers and of the forest products industry in Montana is to maintain a healthy, vibrant forest with lots of wildlife. All of these folks got into this profession because they love the outdoors, they love Montana, they love the forest, they're hunters, they're fishermen, they're hikers, they're backpackers, and they want to make sure that we continue to have vibrant forests, functional forests. A question comes up as to how do our forest policies, how does all this stuff end up in a court of law? Why are timber sales appealed? And partially we have had some hallmark laws passed to try and protect the integrity of these natural systems. The National Environmental Protection Act, known as NEPA, and the Endangered Species Act. And the purpose of these laws, idealistically, is to provide an overview, a review process of any kind of management activity that occurs out here that involves moving soil or harvesting trees, etc. And by their very nature, they're idealistic in nature, they're on the right track. I mean, everybody signed on to them because they thought they were a good idea. The problem arises is that you're dealing with a very complex system here with thousands of moving parts, and these laws require almost 100% predictability and accuracy in what's going to happen out there, which is impossible to do because the climate may change, the weather changes, you have different trees, different understory vegetation, different wildlife, different understory. On top of that, you also have different land ownerships out here. You have 25 million acres of forested land in Montana. Approximately 17 million of that is under federal jurisdiction. National parks, the biggest portion is National Forest System. And National Forest has to comply with Endangered Species Act and the NEPA process out there. Private landowners only really have a couple laws that, in Montana that is, that dictate how and what they do. One is the Streamside Management Zone law that protects water quality, and the other is the slash hazard reduction law, that when they do log, they have to reduce the woody debris to the point where in a bad fire day, it's called a standard bad day, and you get a fire in there, you don't get flames higher than 4 feet, which means if they're lower than 4 feet, you can get a crew on it and put it out. If it's higher than that, there's too much energy, and then you can only try and contain it. So the crux of a lot of this debate is on national forest land, but it does impact private landowners as well. And here's how that happens. National forest land has the vast majority of the timber on it. Private forest lands is 3.5 million acres, 18% of the forest land base in Montana. That 18% of the forest land base has traditionally been providing 30 to 40% of the annual harvest in Montana. Now it's probably up to close to 70% of the annual harvest in Montana. And the problem is that 3.5 million acres isn't enough to sustain a competitive wood products industry. Not enough resource there. Something has to come off of national forest land to provide a competitive market. And what I mean by a competitive market is that you have sawmills that are bidding for the logs from the same ownerships. That gives landowners the option of finding the best suitable price. It also forces industry to stay competitive, stay cutting edge, rather than having a monopoly of timber out there. And so what happens on national forest land has a direct impact on private land as well. Now, this also occurs on an ecological basis. When you have huge wildfires, or like the mountain pine beetle epidemic, where you're having more than 1 million acres of trees killed every year on national forest land, those beetles and that fire doesn't stay on national forest land. They don't care about fence lines, and they spill over onto private land. So I've dealt with numerous private landowners that have done everything right on their land. They've thinned it, they have reduced the fire hazard, and all of a sudden, all around them, the forest is red. You're having billions and billions and billions of bark beetles spill over onto their property, and even the most healthy forest under those conditions won't survive. It's like being the only healthy person in a smallpox epidemic. Okay, you're going to come down with it, no matter what you do and how many vitamins you take. So what happens on national forest land has a direct impact on private land. Now, private land forest management is probably the example of where cutting-edge forestry occurs, because foresters, loggers can practice most state-of-the-art types of forest management. National forest lands now, I hear estimates that to get a forest management plan implemented from start of the project to where they're actually out there thinning the trees requires almost 10 years. Okay? So to respond to something like wildfire or climate change or bark beetle, if it takes you 10 years from the start of the planning process to the actual implementation phase, you're 10 years out of date by the time you get to where you're actually trying to solve or provide a moderation to the process that's going on out there. So I know it frustrates Forest Service personnel enormously. There's some outstanding people working there. They've got the expertise, they have the ability, but they're constantly being required to come up with 100% predictability as far as the outcome of their project, which is not possible in a system like this. I mean, there's so many different things going on, and it doesn't mean that it's going to be bad. Having variability in your outcome is part of the beauty of these systems. If everything worked predictably, it wouldn't be as interesting. That's what we like about natural systems. Here's regen, here's big old trees, here's a place where it burned, here's a place where bark beetles are operating. Okay? This is what makes a dynamic and interesting system, and that's what creates the wildlife habitat and the diversity that we want.